Escape vector plotted. Coordinate formed. Launch.
Welcome, dear listener, to the Escape Vector podcast. Today, I'm joined in studio by my 2.5-week-old newborn baby. Today, we're talking about the Last Voyage of the Bean Barge, a scenario written by Watt for their Cloud Empress ecological science fantasy RPG. I wouldn't call this a review, but a reflection on what it was like to run it and what tips I can share with other game masters. I would say this episode is for GMs. There will be some spoilers for this scenario and for our 2 actual play episodes. If you haven't listened to them already, check out our feed. If you are a potential player, I would recommend this as a good introductory scenario and would suggest that you share this episode and our 2 actual play episodes with your GM. The scenario is a small 10-page booklet and could be wrapped up in 3 to 4 hours. There will be spoilers beyond this point, and the final segment of this episode will include some unreleased commentary from our players. So let's start with a scenario synopsis. Player characters board a beaten-up airship called the Bean Barge. Its trip itinerary is supposed to be from a cloud city to a human settlement below. The player characters might be able to keep it on track for a safe arrival, but among the cast of NPCs, someone's covering up a violent crime, and someone else has another destination in mind. It's dramatic and time-sensitive. It's a great setup. Okay, so now let's talk about the organization of this booklet. The scenario booklet starts with the scenario's background. There's great artwork here. There's some preamble text that could be read aloud or could be paraphrased to your players, depending on how you want to start off the interactive part of the scenario. So the actual game play, where the players start making choices and playing within. There's a great random counters table, ship locations table, a table for a timeline. If the player characters aren't doing anything or if they are distracted. So this is a timeline that keeps the story moving. There are really handy non-player character profiles collected here. You have their name, some basic stats that will be handy for a GM when making stat check rolls or save rolls. So really easy stat blocks to follow. Really easy non-player character inventory. So what they're carrying with them. There are some text blocks for each non-player character that describe their background and also their motivations. There's a beautiful ship map and key. The style of the map and map key might be familiar to fans of the Mothership science fiction horror RPG, in that it's pretty minimalist. There's a really nice Super Nintendo kind of aesthetic to the map, and the key has descriptions of each room or area of the map. These range from 2 to 3 sentences to longer, depending on all the different things that could be going on in a room, but overall very easy to use while running the game. And they paint a great picture of the room's appearance and its contents. You don't need many other materials to run this scenario. I would say dice, character sheets, and the rulebook. The PDF version of the rulebook is free on DriveThruRPG. I would say from the rulebook, it's essential to have tables like the Imago behavior table, the Imago stat blocks, the weapons table, the spell and crest tables, and the table at the back of the book that gives the search results for different size containers and areas. My first recommendation is determine the boundaries, and by that I mean decide the gameplay starting point. For example, my players started just before boarding the Bean Barge. For this group of players, I thought that some low-stakes roleplay would be a good way to introduce characters. But if this isn't your player character's first appearances, you could start them on board. Another subpoint here is deciding how long the scenario will be played for, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I ran this scenario in a single 3-hour session. Because I opted to start the game just before boarding the ship, and I opted to include all 3 storylines given, there was a lot to keep track of, and I think I would have instead run this in 2 sessions, about 2 hours each. I have to admit I was pretty tired after running this in 1 session, and I feel like having a break between sessions would have given me time to reevaluate how the story was going and what interventions would have been appropriate. And a third subpoint here is to ask your players to have a backup character ready. We'll come back to this when I talk about hazards later on. Okay, some GMs might be able to read this scenario through once or twice, then run the game and adapt as needed, but I wouldn't recommend that strategy. Like I said, there's quite a bit going on, and that's why my next group of recommendations relate to shaping the game. And the first subpoint for this is about storylines. Look at the timeline and note the 3 converging storylines: Sippa's murder of Lord Lace, Genmo's hijacking, the Imago attacking the Bean Barge for its chalk engine and any corpses. Decide which ones you want to keep. A session 0 might identify additional storylines your PCs might want to bring to the scenario. When you have the storylines selected, think about the default prompts or hints that could entice or involve your players and their player characters. For example, I decided to prompt an introduction to the Sippa storyline, especially knowing that one of the PCs was a healer. And that prompt, in a way, is actually from the unpublished earlier version of this scenario. And for my session, I foreshadowed and hinted at the Genmo storyline, but the PCs didn't follow that thread quickly enough, and I decided as a consequence, and guided by the timeline table, Genmo broke into the weapons locker and held up the captain off screen. One PC eventually wanted to contact the captain, and I used a few hints to indicate something was not quite right in the bridge or cockpit. The next subpoint is about pacing and random encounters. The scenario is designed to be action-packed and to escalate, but you might have players who are discovering this world for the first time or are inexperienced in tabletop role-playing games. In those cases, introducing action as frequently as noted in the booklet might interrupt your players. And even worse, constantly ramping up threats or things going wrong despite the player's efforts and successes might turn them off. In an unpublished earlier version of this scenario, the author explicitly recommends that the GM discusses with players the idea that they will add tension to the scenario, not to undermine the PCs, but to build a cinematic experience. I strongly recommend doing this with your players before playing the scenario, and maintain that trust during. And about random encounters, another point here is to pre-roll a few random encounters. I had 4 ready, but felt only 2 fit nicely with how our game session was going. I also pre-rolled the ship locations where unengaged Imago, or those the PCs lost track of, would go to and attack. Once the Imago are introduced, you could use this table to continually tear PCs between tasks and competing priorities, but use your judgment for what is appropriate based on the number of players, where the story is, your gameplay time boundaries, and what your players are interested in. The third subpoint is about survival. While preparing for the session, take note of some of the different ways the PCs could survive the Bean Barge's demise in the event it is doomed. For example, escape pod safety is not guaranteed. There is a 20% chance of receiving 1 wound and a 10% chance of outright dying. Menfa knows the spell Levitate, and you could offer a way for a PC to learn it from her. The Scout Thopter is a good pick, if it is available. Think of more if you think it would be helpful, and be ready to adapt. And you also can't blame your players for finding an easy way off the Bean Barge. So if you're worried your PCs will immediately run for the Thopter, make it so that the key is somewhere else on the ship, like in the first mate's possession. If they insist on taking the Thopter quite quickly, then bring some tension to that. While hot-wiring the Thopter, an Imago or 2 burst through the hull. And if there's plenty of game time left, have a flock of Imago or stray cannon shots from a nearby battle barge threaten the Thopter escape. and in those cases, call for piloting checks. The next group of recommendations are hazards. And by this I mean diversify the Imago defenses and attacks, and use the Imago behavior table in the rulebook. Remember that full-grown Imago have telekinesis. They can use their psychic powers to move things. The upper deck is open, meaning that the wind is blowing and the characters can fall off the sides of the Bean Barge. I sort of regret not using the Imago's telekinetic abilities on the top deck to threaten my player characters. I think it would have been wrong to outright throw someone overboard in one turn, but perhaps hinting at that being a possibility without intervention would have made for good tension. I also should have remembered the different Imago patterns of behavior. Juvenile Imago are also quite dangerous for the chance of angering and essentially bringing more full-grown Imago into the situation. Okay, let's wrap this up with some final thoughts. Overall, I'm happy with how this scenario went. I was really surprised by what the player characters did, and I appreciate the players for being such good sports. It might not be a surprise, but my favorite moment was the critical failure that happened in the first combat encounter of our actual play. We still talk about it weeks later. My second favorite was the hijack scene. I was really surprised that the PC strategy worked out there. And my third favorite was integrating a new PC into the story in a way that fit thematically. I feel like there were a few things I should have approached differently, but I would have had more space or breathing room to consider and commit to those things if I had split this into 2 sessions. I am glad I prepped a little bit for this and didn't just run it on the fly. The map and map key were really helpful, though you may need to think of a few things like how communications work on this vessel, where the medical kits and safety kits are, and where maps would be, and more. If you are running this as a single session one-shot, I would recommend excluding one storyline from the outset, or drop it if you notice your players are not engaging with it or have too much else on their plates. Like I said when I started this episode, this is a good one. I really recommend it. Check out the free, I repeat, free PDFs for the rulebook and the Last Voyage of the Bean Barge on the Drive-Thru RPG online store. You can follow Cloud Empress developments on cloudempress.com. You can also follow Watt on Blue Sky. The tag will be in the show notes. Stick around after the credits. We'll play some unreleased commentary from my players. Our music is from Epidemic Sound. Check out the show notes for credits. As always, thanks to our listeners. Connect with us on Instagram or by email. Tell your friends and gaming community. And finally, lock on to our coordinates. Subscribe to our feed and set a notification for when our episodes release. Over and out.
Ooh, nice. Woo!
Future adventures or misadventures?
That's so funny. I'm laughing at that spell. That unfortunate.
That was an awesome idea that turned bad.
That's
Like
so
is like almost all of this good
Dimension door?
idea actually do. Yeah, it's
okay.
not the first time, or it's not the first time he does that for sure.
I had good intentions.
yeah.
Oh, the idea was fantastic,
Absolutely.
but then
It failed miserably, but that was not the intention.